Before we get started, I thought I would share something with you I'd come across and dealing with the church in Cuba. In the late 1950s, Castro and the Communist Party came to power. And as they did, they told the churches and the religious leaders, said, "Don't worry, we're going to be your friends. We're gonna build a utopia together." And then, of course, what happened when they took control? They came down hard on the churches and the leaders. Preachers were arrested, some were killed. Those who could fled the country. And you can just imagine what that does to the church. You take out its leaders, and then the members are threatened. So if you come to church, you're going to be arrested too. So it doesn't strengthen the church, right? It kind of tears it apart. The leaders who were left did the best they could, but the most articulate, most spoken preachers, they were the ones who were arrested first. And so it just didn't leave much left, and those who were did what they could. And of course, as I mentioned, the members who were left, when you start threatening arrest, then those who aren't there for the right reason stop coming altogether. Those are the first to leave. And so what remained were those who were truly committed to God, and they cried out to God. And so in the late 1980s, a spiritual hunger swept across the country. The preachers who remained were preaching in their homes. Shacks, right? I mean, compared to our standards, there wasn't much there. And so what happened is that the people just started coming in droves, and they would be lined up outside the door because you can only get so many people in a small house. And then the preachers had to start giving out tickets. All right, this is when you can come, and then you have to leave, right? You can be here from here to here, and then you got to leave so the next group can come in. That'd be a good problem, wouldn't it? We got to throw you out because we got too many people so that we can make room for the next people, the next group, and then they got to leave to make room for the next group. And so the government caught wind of that, and they started cracking down. But the church leaders say that then at night, the government leaders would come in the back door. So we want to know about God. We want to know why all these people are coming. We want to know as well. This is revival. It's a moving of God across a country. One denominational leader in Cuba said that in the late 1980s, their denomination had about 17,000 people, members throughout the country. And that 20 years later, they had over 300,000 members. And this is a place where the church is illegal. I mean, well, it's not. They can meet, but it's difficult. It's revival. It's people desperate to know God and crying out to Him, because they know they don't have anything else. God is their only hope. And so when we come to that realization that we have nothing without God, and that we cry out to Him, that He comes and revives us, fills us, and that's what we need to understand, how deeply we really need God. So it's encouraging to hear those kinds of stories in these countries, because you hear about the country, you don't hear about on the news, you don't hear about the church. You don't hear what the Christians are doing. So it's hard to get stories like that. Some of you will remember Michael Householder, who's been here several times. He's been down to Cuba in the last 5 years, a couple of dozen times, and he gives similar stories about his trips and what he finds. And it's just amazing what God is doing there. Well, we are in 2 Corinthians 12, so you can go and turn to 2 Corinthians 12. Have you ever noticed that people like to gossip? You ever noticed that? You probably hadn't noticed that. We like to tell it, and we like to hear it. And that's slide 2. We're more than willing to listen, to things that paint people in a bad picture. And here's what Proverbs has to say. Michael keeps putting it up. Now you can put it up. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 8. The words of a gossip are like choice morsels. They go down to the inmost parts. Choice morsels. I keep saying that. Choice morsels, right? You talk like that? Who talks about their food like that? Gee, Mary Ann, that food is just choice morsels tonight. But what he's saying is that it was like really good food that you love to eat. It's like me and chocolate chip cookies, right? I can't get enough, right? That's the way he says it is with gossip. We just, for whatever reason, we want more. It was true when Solomon wrote, it's true today, and it was true for the Corinthians as well. The Corinthians were believing some gossip that was being told about Paul. False teachers were spreading lies about him. They were spreading lies about his motives, telling them the people, and the people were just gobbling it up like choice morsels. They just couldn't seem to get enough. They believed it. And so Paul had to defend himself against the false teachers, and that's what he's been doing for the last couple of chapters that we've been reading. And so we pick up where we left off last week with verse 11. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 11. Paul says, I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I've made myself a fool, and it's your fault. As I've mentioned, Paul thought it was foolish to boast about himself. There's no reason for the boasting, no benefit. But he had been doing so anyway. He had made himself a fool by boasting to them, and then he blames the Corinthians for forcing him to do that. And the reason he blames them is because they knew him. They knew the truth. They knew about his ministry. They knew about his teachings. They knew about his sufferings. And then they believed the worst when these false teachers started spreading these lies. They should have been defending Paul, but they didn't. And so Paul wrote, continuing in verse 11, I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, these false teachers, even though I am nothing. Again, they should have been standing up for Paul. They should have been defending him against these accusations, but they didn't. And so as a result, Paul was forced to defend himself, his ministry, his apostleship, his authority. And the only way he could do so was through this boasting. Verse 12, I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. The true signs. And part of the true signs were his suffering, right? That he suffered for them. In other words, true ministers for Jesus will patiently and quietly suffer for Jesus, while the false teachers, they just talk about how good they are and then complain if there's any difficulties and the slightest inconvenience. And then in addition to these sufferings, Paul said that he showed he was a true apostle because he had signs, wonders, and miracles. Signs, wonders, and miracles. Those all sound like the same to me, but there's some slight differences. A sign is something like a street sign. It points you to something else. Wonders, it evoke awe. They grab attention. Miracles demonstrate that there's a power in you working, that's beyond you, beyond your ability. And the unifying factor of the signs, the wonders, and the miracles is that they all lead to God. To God working in Paul. And that was the proof that he was a true apostle. These things the false teachers were saying weren't true, that he was an apostle sent by God. Now, Paul had done something differently when he came to Corinth that he hadn't done in any other of the other churches he had helped to start. And what he'd done differently is he hadn't asked for any money. Because of his experience as a tent maker, he had worked with Aquila and Priscilla making tents. And he writes in verse 13, "How were you inferior to the other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me for this wrong. Forgive me for not begging you for money. Forgive me for not demanding that you give me money." Sounds a little tongue-in-cheek, all right? Forgive me for not asking for money. A friend of mine posted on Facebook a couple of days ago, and he reposted it, I'm assuming, so maybe you've seen this. He said, "I've done some terrible things for money, like getting up early to go to work." Terrible things for money. That's what Paul had done. He had worked for it, right? The old-fashioned way. He had worked for it instead of begging for money because he didn't want to be a burden on this new congregation. And now he wonders, well, maybe that wasn't the best policy. Maybe I should have asked for at least a little money, right? Just a little support. But Paul didn't. And because he didn't, it sounds like they're saying, well, if he doesn't think any more of himself than to ask for money, how much could he be worth? How much could his instructions be worth? Right? It's like putting something out on the road and, hoping somebody will take it and no one ever takes it. It sits out there for days. And so you put a sign on it, "For sale, $50. In less than an hour, it's gone." Right? Now they think it's worth something, and so they'll take it. If Paul didn't think he was worth enough to charge money for it, maybe that's because it wasn't worth charging money for his instruction. Because again, that was the common practice of the day. These teachers would roll into town with this new information, and you need to know this, but in order to get it, you got to have money. You go on YouTube, Facebook, you'll see advertisements. I found the way to make money doing whatever. I found the way to losing weight. I found the way I got the secret, and all you got to do is buy my course. Right? You've seen advertisements like that. That was the common practice of the day. And so since he was giving it away, maybe it wasn't worth anything. And so Paul was having some second thoughts. Maybe he should have asked for some money. But he wasn't less of an apostle than these false teachers whom he jokingly refers to as super apostles. Man, y'all have some super apostles. They're not just regular apostles. Y'all got super apostles. Verse 14. "Now I am ready to visit you for the third time, and I will not be a burden to you, because what I want is not your possessions, but you. After all, children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children." Now, do you remember what I've said about Paul's visits? That Paul had visited in his letters up. Now you can put up on the screen that list. Paul had first visited Corinth in Acts. There you go. Paul had first visited Corinth in Acts chapter 18. And he left, and he wrote a letter which we no longer have. And then he wrote a second letter, which is our 1 Corinthians. Paul then made a quick visit, which he refers to in 2 Corinthians as a sorrowful visit. He writes a third letter, which is lost, and then we have 2 Corinthians, his fourth letter, which is 2 Corinthians. And then Paul says he's going to make a third visit. Right? So he plans on making a third visit to collect some money that he's going to take to the churches in Jerusalem. All right. So he's saying, I'm getting ready to make this third visit, which he had already mentioned in chapter 9, again, when he was talking about this offering to take to Jerusalem. But he wanted to make sure they understood that when he came, he wasn't coming for their money, right? To ask them for money for himself anyway. He's going to take some money, but it's going to be for someone else. It's not going to be for him. Even after all of this, he's still not going to ask money for himself. He refuses to take their money. And the reason he gives is because as a spiritual parent to them, he doesn't want to take money from his spiritual children any more than a parent wants to take money from their child. He wanted a relationship with them. And he was afraid that if he asked for money, if he took money from them, it would get in the way of that relationship with them. And that's why he hadn't asked for money in the first place. He wanted to make sure that they understood his motives for being there. They were pure. Marianne and I watched a documentary recently. A preacher made a visit to Iraq. And he interviewed a man who leads a ministry that's working in the Middle East. And when that year-long battle of Mosul was going on, that guy was there. I mean, shooting, bombings, he was there. And not only was he was there with his wife and 2 children. Now, his wife and 2 children weren't in Mosul. They were a couple of miles away. But still, would you want to take your family to Iraq right now? And it's probably better now than it was 2 years ago, but it's still not great. But what it showed the local leaders was that he was there for their benefit and not his own. He wasn't there because he liked to shoot people, right? Get involved in a battle. I just want to go into war. Right? No, he was there to help them, and him taking his family with them is showing, look, I want to, your families are here. I want to help your families. I want to help you. And he said, as a result, the leader said, whatever you want, you can have it. I mean, the stories he tells, just mind-boggling, the things that he was able to do. He's been able to do in Iraq, in Syria, because of that. Them opening their doors. They no longer questioned his motives. And Paul didn't want the Corinthians to doubt the sincerity of his motives. He was there not for himself. He was there for them. He didn't want their stuff. He wanted them. He wanted a relationship with them. He wanted what was best for them. Verse 15, so I will very gladly spend for you everything I have and expend myself as well. Now, we don't see this in the NIV, but the word spend is found twice. In the NIV, it doesn't say spend, but expend, but that's similar, right? Spend and expend. The English Standard words it this way. It says, I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. The first, he's spending money. He's using his own resources and not charging them in order that they might know God, that they might hear the gospel and come to believe the gospel. He worked to earn a living. He received help from other churches that had sent him help, but he didn't rely on the money of the Corinthians. And then the second spending was physical. He's expending his energy, his time, his life. He gave of himself in order to be a witness for them. And what's sad is we read they hadn't responded. Not like we might expect them to for all that Paul had given. Paul had done more for the Corinthians than he had done for any other congregation. In multiple ways, he had demonstrated his love for them, and they were resisting him and not returning that love. Verse 15, end of verse 15, he says, if I love you more, will you love me less? If I love you more, will you love you less? It's hard to continue to give yourself to someone, for someone, when they don't appreciate it. Kind of hard to get excited about serving when they just ignore it or take it for granted. But Paul continues to give himself for the Corinthians, and it proves, the comparison of himself to a parent is an accurate description. It's only a parent that can love that way. Only parents are willing to give themselves, for their children with little expectation, no expectation of return, as Paul had given for the Corinthians. Think about what that teaches us about serving each other, serving those outside the church. Again, it's a lot easier to serve someone when we know they're thankful. But what about when they're not thankful? What about when they're not appreciative? When they think they just deserve our service? Can we continue to show them love and grace? And it's difficult, but that's what Jesus did. It's what Paul did. Right? Jesus continued to love and to forgive, even on the cross, when he knew the majority of the people he was asking God to forgive, right? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was offering forgiveness when the majority would never accept the forgiveness he was offering from the cross. Can we continue to serve others, even when they aren't thankful? Only then have we demonstrated true love. If we're only serving because people are thankful, that is our payment. They're thanks. And there's nothing wrong with liking to be appreciated or even wanting to be appreciated. But if that becomes the major reason for serving, then it's an issue, because our service isn't going to last very long if that's the reason. As soon as the thanks run out, so does our service. And so we must serve simply because of our love for God, our love for others, and not because of our love for acclaim. And so Paul had done for the Corinthians, served them even when they weren't thankful, even when that love wasn't returned. Verse 16, be that as it may, even though you haven't returned that love, he says, I have not been a burden to you. Even though they hadn't appreciated what he's done, he's continued to serve, and he's refused to take their money. He said, yet, crafty fellow that I am, I caught you by my trickery. It sounds like that's one of the lies that was being charged against Paul. You know how he didn't charge you for his instruction? That was part of his trickery. What he's doing is he's trying to get in on, to make you feel good towards him, and then he's going to lay it to you. He's just trying to make you be friends toward him so he can trick you. And Paul's saying he didn't trick them. The only trick he had was he loved them. He sacrificed for them. Verse 17, did I exploit you through any of the men I sent to you? I urged Titus to go to you and sent our brother with him. Titus did not exploit you, did he? Did we not walk in the same footsteps by the same Spirit? So Paul had been there when he started the church. He hadn't asked for any money. He hadn't exploited them. He had returned. He didn't exploit them. He had sent Titus and another guy to go help them. They didn't ask for money. They didn't exploit them. So he had had opportunity. If he wanted to exploit them, he had opportunity and hadn't. So if he was going to trick them, when was he going to do it? When was he going to be dishonest? But he hadn't tricked them. He hadn't been dishonest. He'd been upfront with them all along. He had done nothing but seek their good. The world thinks that Christians have an agenda and that churches are just out for their money. You've heard that, probably. Yeah, you just want my money. And maybe that's because there are false teachers on TV who are like that, right? Send me your money and God's going to bless you. Not send your money to God. No, if God's going to bless you, you got to send your money to me. And so there are false teachers who do just that, and it paints a bad picture. Makes everyone think. Make them think that everyone's like that. But Paul's insisting that he isn't like that. We need to be careful to make sure that our true agendas are known. We're not there for people's money. We truly want to help people. We want people to know about Jesus, right? That we're only motivated by our love for God and our love for them. And so we need to make sure our motives are pure and correct. Verse 19, have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? All right, now, so Paul's been asking a series of questions. I don't know if you've noticed that as we in verses 18 and 19, he says, did I exploit you? Did the men I send to you exploit you? Didn't they treat you just like I treat you? And now he asked, do you think we're trying to make ourselves look good? Do you think that the reason I've been boasting is so I'll look good in your eyes? And really, Paul didn't care what they thought. Paul didn't mind. It didn't matter to him what they thought about him. As long as he was right with God, what others thought about him didn't matter. The story is told that on one occasion, Abraham Lincoln and his advisors had made an important decision. And one of the advisors said, well, Mr. President, I hope that God is on our side. And Lincoln is reported to have answered, what I'm worried about is not if God is on our side, but if we are on God's side. We want to make sure we're on God's side. And Paul thought, as long as I'm on God's side, it doesn't matter what other people are saying. It only matters what God is saying. So why was Paul boasting? Well, he was only defending his ministry, not so he would look good, but so that the Corinthians would trust him and continue to believe in the gospel that he was teaching and not fall for these false teachers. Because if they doubted Paul, that what Paul was saying was true, then they wouldn't listen to his advice, they wouldn't believe the gospel, and they would believe the false teachers. And then Paul repeats this goal. We have been speaking, verse 19, we have been speaking in the sight of God as those in Christ, and everything we do, dear friends, is for your strengthening. Everything we do is for you, to help you, to encourage you, to strengthen your faith. As I mentioned several weeks ago, when we look at Paul's difficulties, the things that he had faced, that gone through, to bring the gospel to the Corinthians and to the others as well. There's no amount of money you could pay someone to make them do that. Who wants to be shipwrecked out on a boat for weeks, not knowing if you're going to survive? Right? Well, there's one hand. Oh, no, sorry. Oh, oops, sorry. No one wants to be stoned, beaten, thrown in jail, right? No one volunteers for that. I don't care how much money. And yet Paul went through this, not because of money, not because of fame, but because of his love for them. Paul was only interested in sharing the love of God. He was only interested in the welfare of the Corinthians. Paul says, we've only done this for your benefit, that you may grow in your faith. Verse 20. For I am afraid that when I come, I may not find you as I want you to be, and you may not find me as you want me to be. When I get there, if you're ignoring what I've sent, then I'm going to have to correct you, and you're not going to like me like that. I'm not going to be like you want me to be, which is kind and gentle. But I'm not going to be kind and gentle if you're still following the ways that I've told you not to follow. And then he gives this list. I fear that there may be discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, slander, gossip, arrogance, and disorder. Paul says, he's afraid that they're listening to these false teachers and ignoring the letters he'd written, ignoring the instructions he'd given. And he didn't want to have to come to them and go over all of this again. To be harsh with them again. And so he lists these things, right? The marks of an unchristian church: quarreling, jealousy, anger, selfishness, slander, gossip, arrogance, disorderly behavior. And then in the last verse, he's going to list a few more. He says, "I am afraid that when I come again, my God will humble me before you, and I will be grieved over many who have sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery in which they have indulged." Now, you read those two lists in verse 20 and then in verse 21, and you think, are you sure he's writing to Christians? Those don't sound like Christians. Don't sound like Christian behaviors. And the part of the problem is that this is the lifestyle they'd come out of. Corinth was the worst city in the entire Roman Empire. It's not like the Roman Empire was full of virtuous people. It wasn't. But Corinth was the worst. That was their background. And so if they weren't careful, it'd be easy for them to slide back into those old habits. And Paul is hoping that they will read his letters, that they'll listen to these letters, that they'll repent, and that they'll straighten out their lives before he comes. In his commentary on Corinthians, and particularly on this passage, Richard Pratt wrote about a man that he knew. He didn't know him well, but he recognized him. And one day a friend of his told him about this man. He said that the man had fought in World War II, that he was a Marine, and that he had rescued about 50 other Marines. Not too bad. And had captured several enemy soldiers all by himself. And Pratt says, when he looked at the man, he just looked, there was nothing that, just drew your attention to him. He looked pretty ordinary, unassuming. You'd never think there was anything special about him. But he said after hearing that, he never looked at him the same. When he knew those things about him. Paul's defending himself. And the Corinthians should have thought about Paul the same way Pratt now felt about this World War II hero. They knew the background information. They didn't need to be told, but Paul tells them anyway. They didn't need to be told. Paul had done so much for them, and they were taking it for granted, questioning Paul's motives, fooled by these false teachers into thinking that Paul wasn't, he's not all that impressive. Don't worry about him. Don't listen to him. After Paul revealed to them how much he had done, the church should have been impressed. And they should have rejected anyone who stood against Paul, against his authority. We live in a day when there are people, lots of people who have problems with authority, don't want to listen to authority. We don't want to voluntarily submit to anyone. We only obey when we have to. These false teachers were questioning Paul's authority, and as a result, they were causing people to ignore him, ignore his instructions, ignore the gospel. This passage from Paul encourages us to look at how trustworthy Paul was. Not just for the Corinthians, but for ourselves as well. We can read these letters, right, and know that they're the truth. We can follow them, obey them. Aren't we thankful for Paul, for the letters he wrote? Thankful for God's word, the authority that it has, even for our lives.